Hello, and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she visits the town of Delft in the Netherlands on a lovely spring day. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember, just settle in, get comfortable and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The train from Amsterdam pulled into Delft station with a gentle pneumatic sigh, and Lyla gathered her things. Just a small crossbody bag and a light jacket, though the April morning was mild enough that she probably wouldn't need it. Through the window she could see the modern station building, all glass and clean lines, and beyond it, the hint of older architecture that promised the historic center she'd come to explore. She stepped onto the platform and followed the flow of passengers toward the exit. The station was busy but not crowded. Commuters heading to work, students with backpacks, a few tourists consulting maps on their phones. Everything moved with that particular Dutch efficiency she'd noticed since arriving in the Netherlands. Orderly without being rigid, purposeful without being rushed. Outside, the morning air was fresh and clear, carrying the faint green scent of spring, and something else she was learning to associate with Dutch cities: water and old stone and bicycles. Especially bicycles. The bike parking area adjacent to the station was enormous, a sea of two-wheeled transportation stretching in organized rows, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, in every style and color imaginable. Lyla paused to orient herself, pulling out the small paper map she'd picked up at her hotel in Amsterdam. The historic center was a 10-minute walk south, through the newer parts of the city, and then across one of the canals that ringed the old town like protective moats. She tucked the map away and started walking, deciding she'd rather discover the route than follow it precisely. The streets near the station were modern and practical. Apartment blocks, offices, a few shops. But even here, she could see the attention to design that characterized Dutch urbanism. Buildings that were functional but not ugly, public spaces that included greenery and thoughtful paving, bike lanes wider than the car lanes in some places. Tulips bloomed in planters, red and yellow and pink, their colors almost absurdly cheerful in the morning light. As she walked, the buildings began to change, becoming older, more varied. A 19th century facade here, an Art Nouveau detail there, the city's layers revealing themselves gradually. She passed a small market setting up, vendors arranging flowers and vegetables and cheese. The stalls still sparse but promising plenty once they were fully stocked. And then, ahead, she saw the canal, or rather, one of the canals that encircled the old center. A stone bridge arched over it, and she crossed, pausing halfway to look at the water. It was green-brown and perfectly still, reflecting the buildings on either side with barely a ripple. A duck paddled past, followed by 3 ducklings in a tidy line, and Lyla smiled at their determination, their small feet working beneath the surface. The buildings along the canal were classic Dutch, tall and narrow, with step gables and large windows, painted in soft colors or faced with brick. Many had dates inscribed near their roof lines: 1653, 1702, 1589, evidence of their age and the burgher pride that had built them. Window boxes held pansies and early geraniums, their colors bright against the brick and painted wood. She crossed the bridge and found herself suddenly, completely in Old Delft. The change was immediate. The streets narrowed, became cobbled, the buildings pressed closer together. The scale was intimate and human, designed for walking and for centuries predating cars. She felt herself slow down naturally, matching the pace of the place. A cyclist passed her, a woman in business attire, pedaling effortlessly despite the cobblestones, a leather bag in her front basket, her posture upright and confident. This was followed by another cyclist, this one an older man, with a small dog sitting patiently in his front basket, and then a teenager on a phone call, steering one-handed, completely at ease. Lyla had learned quickly that in the Netherlands, bicycles weren't recreation. They were transportation, as natural as walking, and everyone from children to grandparents navigated the streets with casual expertise. She wandered without particular direction, following streets that curved and intersected in the organic pattern of medieval cities. The canal appeared again, or perhaps it was a different canal. She couldn't be entirely sure, and she followed it, the water keeping her company. The morning sun caught the ripples created by a passing duck, turning them into small flashes of light. Trees along the canal were in fresh leaf, that particular luminous green of spring growth, and their reflection in the water doubled their beauty. Delft had a different quality than Amsterdam, quieter, more contained, less cosmopolitan but somehow more itself. This was a university town, home to Delft University of Technology, but it was also the city of Vermeer, of blue and white pottery, of a particular kind of Dutchness that felt both proud and unpretentious. She passed a shop window displaying Delftware, those blue and white ceramics that had been produced here for centuries. Plates and vases and tiles, all decorated with windmills or tulips or classic Dutch scenes, their patterns intricate and precise. She knew the history, how Dutch potters in the 17th century had tried to imitate Chinese porcelain and created instead their own distinctive style. Some of the pieces in the window were traditional, others more contemporary, proof that the craft was still living and evolving. The street opened onto a square, the marked Delft Central Market Square, and Lyla stopped at its edge to take it in. The square was large and open, paved in a pattern of light and dark stones. To her left, the new kirk rose. The new church, though it dated from the 14th century, its Gothic tower soaring upward, brick and stone reaching toward the pale blue sky. The tower leaned slightly, she noticed, or perhaps that was an optical illusion. Across the square stood the Stadhuis, the town hall, its Renaissance facade elegant and symmetrical, with a tower of its own, more delicate than the church tower but no less impressive. Between these two anchors the square was coming alive. Market stalls were being set up for the Thursday market, vendors arranging their goods, early shoppers already browsing. Lyla walked into the square, drawn by the activity. The market was still setting up, but already the variety was evident. Cheese vendors with wheels and blocks in a dozen varieties, flower sellers with buckets of tulips and daffodils, vegetable stands with produce that looked impossibly fresh and perfect, vendors selling herring and stroopwafels and fresh bread. She approached a cheese stand, where a cheerful man in an apron was arranging his display. The cheeses were labeled with small signs, Gouda, Edam, laden with cumin seeds, aged varieties in various stages of maturity. The vendor saw her interest and immediately offered samples, slicing thin pieces from different wheels with practiced strokes of his knife. "Try this one," he said in English, handing her a slice of aged Gouda. 18 months. Very good. Lyla tasted it, firm and crystalline in texture, complex and slightly sweet, with that particular depth that comes from aging. It was delicious. She tried several others, each distinct, and ended up buying a small wedge of the aged Gouda, wrapped in paper and tucked into her bag. At a flower stall, tulips stood in metal buckets, red, yellow, pink, purple, white striped varieties in combinations she'd never seen. They were ridiculously cheap by any standard, and she was tempted to buy a bunch just to carry them around, though she had nowhere to put them. The vendor, an older woman with kind eyes and weathered hands, seemed to sense her dilemma. "Just enjoy looking," she said in Dutch-accented English. "That's free." Lyla smiled and thanked her and moved on, appreciating the gentle permission to appreciate without purchasing. She wandered through the developing market, observing the morning routine, vendors perfecting their displays, early shoppers with their market bags, people stopping to chat with familiar vendors, the social aspect as important as the commercial. There was something deeply appealing about it, this weekly ritual, this connection between producers and consumers, this public space being used exactly as it had been designed to be used centuries ago. She bought a stroopwafel from a stand, a thin waffle cookie with caramel syrup sandwiched between two layers, and the vendor placed it warm on top of a paper cup of coffee, letting the heat soften the caramel. After a minute, Lyla lifted it and took a bite, and the combination of crisp waffle and warm gooey caramel was perfect, sweet without being cloying, comforting without being heavy. Coffee in one hand, stroopwafel in the other, she found a bench at the edge of the square and sat to watch the scene. The Nieuwe Kerk tower rose before her, and she tilted her head back to follow it upward, trying to see the top. The church held the remains of William of Orange and other members of the Dutch royal family. She'd read that in her guidebook, and the tower could be climbed for views over the city. Perhaps she'd do that later. For now, sitting and watching felt exactly right. A group of students crossed the square, speaking rapid Dutch, their backpacks suggesting they were heading to class. An older couple walked slowly arm in arm, stopping to examine the market stalls. A man in paint-splattered overalls sat on the church steps, eating a sandwich and reading a paperback. Life in its infinite variety, all of it ordinary, and all of it somehow remarkable. Lyla finished her coffee and stroopwafel, disposed of the cup in a nearby bin, and continued her wandering. She left the market and found herself on a narrow street lined with shops, antique stores, bookshops, cafes, galleries. The street followed a canal, they all seemed to, eventually, and she paused frequently to look at reflections, at the way the water doubled everything, creating a mirror world that was almost but not quite identical to the real one. She found herself thinking about Vermeer, who had lived his entire life in Delft, who had painted this light, these interiors, these ordinary moments elevated to art. She'd seen Girl with a Pearl Earring at the Mauritshuis in The Hague the previous day, and standing before it she'd understood something about the way Vermeer saw, the attention to light and texture, the sense of stillness and contemplation. The feeling that the moment captured was both specific and eternal. This morning, light in Delft had that same quality, clear and even, neither harsh nor dim, but perfect for seeing things as they were. It caught the water and the brick and the fresh spring leaves, and made them all luminous without being dramatic. Quiet beauty, she thought. That's what this was. She crossed another canal and found a street that was nearly empty, the buildings so close together that sunlight barely reached the cobblestones. Here, the sense of history was even stronger. These buildings had been standing for 400 years, watching the city's life unfold, sheltering generations of families. The doorways were worn smooth, The window glass was old and slightly wavy, the brickwork was patched and repaired in places where time had taken its toll. A cat sat in a window at street level, orange and plump, watching her pass with that particular feline expression of being simultaneously interested and utterly indifferent. Lyla paused to look at it, and it blinked slowly, a cat acknowledgement, before turning its attention to something else. The street opened onto another canal. She was becoming convinced that Delft was more water than land, and this one was particularly beautiful. Trees lined both sides, their branches meeting overhead in places, creating a green tunnel. The houses were especially fine here, clearly built by wealthy merchants. Tall windows, ornate gables, some with decorative brickwork or sandstone details. She found a small bridge and stood on it, looking both directions along the canal. To her left, the water curved away, disappearing behind buildings. To her right, it stretched straight for a block or two before turning. A tall boat approached, a flat-bottomed electric boat with a glass roof and perhaps a dozen tourists aboard, their guide speaking into a microphone, pointing out features of the buildings they passed. Lyla moved to the side of the bridge to let the boat pass underneath, and the tourists waved up at her, and she waved back, feeling the slight absurdity of being the observed rather than the observer, part of the authentic street scene they'd paid to see. After the boat passed, she continued along the canal, following it wherever it led. This was the joy of wandering without agenda, the possibility of discovery, the freedom to change direction on whim, the trust that interesting things would appear if you just kept walking. And they did. A tiny courtyard hidden behind an archway, accessible to the public. She noticed the small sign. A Hofje, one of those almshouses built by wealthy benefactors to provide housing for the poor and elderly. She stepped inside and found a perfect small courtyard, surrounded by tiny houses, a garden in the center with flowers and a bench. It was utterly quiet, utterly peaceful, a secret world hidden within the larger city. She sat on the bench for a few minutes, simply absorbing the tranquility. The garden was meticulously maintained, neat borders, healthy plants, not a weed visible. Someone cared for this space, preserved it, kept it beautiful. She thought about the people who lived in the small houses around the courtyard, the legacy of charity that had created this place centuries ago and continued to provide shelter today. Eventually she stood and returned to the street, back into the flow of the city. She passed more shops, more canals, more bridges. A bakery window displayed breads and pastries, dense whole-grain loaves, delicate pastries, the spiral-shaped cookies she'd seen everywhere in the Netherlands. The smell drifting from the open door was yeasty and sweet and irresistible. She found another square, smaller than the marked, with a few café tables set outside, despite the lingering coolness of the morning. She decided to stop, to rest and have a proper coffee, to people watch for a while. The café was cozy inside, but she chose an outside table, wanting to stay in the sun, in the fresh air. A waiter appeared, young, friendly, efficient, and she ordered a cappuccino and, feeling slightly mischievous, an apple tart, Dutch apple pie, even though it was barely mid-morning. The cappuccino arrived first, the foam decorated with a perfect rosette, the cup and saucer elegant and simple. The coffee was smooth and strong, and she cupped her hands around it, enjoying the warmth, even though she didn't need it. The apple tart followed, a substantial slice, the apples thick and barely sweetened, the crust buttery and tender, a dollop of whipped cream on the side. She took a bite and understood immediately why this was a Dutch staple. It was apple pie elevated, refined, perfected over generations of baking. The apples retained their structure, the spices were subtle but present, the crust was flaky without being greasy. With the whipped cream, it was perfect. She ate slowly, watching people pass. More cyclists, always more cyclists. This one with 2 children in a cargo bike, that one with groceries piled impossibly high in panniers, another towing a small trailer. A woman walked past with a tiny dog on a leash, the dog's legs moving in comically rapid steps to keep up. 2 elderly men stopped to talk, their conversation clearly a continuation of something ongoing, hands gesturing, heads nodding. The sun climbed higher, warming her shoulders, and Lyla felt a deep contentment settle over her. This was exactly what she'd wanted. A day without demands, a city small enough to explore on foot, beauty that was understated rather than overwhelming, the pleasure of good coffee and good cake in a pleasant spot. She thought about Delft's history, the explosion in the powder magazine in 1654 that had destroyed a large part of the city, killing Vermeer's patron Karel Fabricius, among hundreds of others. The city had rebuilt, of course, as cities do, and what stood now was largely that post-explosion reconstruction, 17th-century buildings that had now stood for more than 3.5 centuries. There was something in that, the resilience, the determination to rebuild and continue, the refusal to be defined by catastrophe. The city had suffered, had recovered, had thrived, and now existed as this peaceful, beautiful place where people lived ordinary lives, rode bicycles, bought cheese at the market, sat in cafes drinking coffee. She finished her pie and coffee, paid, and set off wandering again. The morning was advancing toward noon, and she wanted to see more before the day got away from her. She found the Oude Kerk, the old church, its leaning tower visible from several streets away. The lean was even more pronounced than the Nieuwe Kerks, the result of subsidence in the soft Dutch soil, and it gave the tower a precarious, almost whimsical appearance. She walked around the church, admiring its Gothic architecture, the way the brick and stone had weathered over centuries. Vermeer was buried here, she knew, not in the church itself, which was reserved for the wealthy and prominent, but in a family grave nearby. She thought about him painting in this city, walking these same streets, seeing this same light, transforming ordinary moments into extraordinary art. The canals led her onward, around corners and across bridges, deeper into the residential areas where tourists were fewer, and the city felt more like itself. Here, people were hanging laundry, washing windows, tending small front gardens. A man was repainting his front door a vibrant blue, his careful brushstrokes transforming the wood. 2 women chatted across a canal from their respective doorways, their voices carrying across the water. Lyla found herself at the eastern edge of the old centre, where the canal was wider, almost a small harbour. Boats were moored along the quay, not the tour boats but personal craft, small sailboats and motorboats, clearly loved and maintained by their owners. The water here was more active, rippled by breeze, and ducks and coots moved across its surface, diving occasionally, coming up with weeds or small fish. She walked along the quay, enjoying the openness after the enclosed streets. Across the water, willow trees trailed their branches nearly to the surface, and behind them, more of those tall, narrow Dutch houses rose in their distinctive silhouettes. The day was properly warm now, and she stopped to remove her jacket, tying it around her waist. The sun felt good on her bare arms, and she realized she was slightly pink. She'd need to be more careful about sun protection as spring advanced into summer. She decided to circle back toward the center, to the market, which would be in full swing now. She retraced her route along different streets, seeing new details, new corners, new small perfections. A door painted the exact color of a robin's egg. A window box with herbs. She could smell the rosemary as she passed. A bicycle leaned against a wall, its basket full of fresh tulips still in their paper wrapping, waiting for their owner to return. The market was busy now, the market fully established, crowds moving between stalls, vendors calling out their wares, the sound of commerce and conversation creating a pleasant hum. Lyla waded back into it, enjoying the energy, the sense of community and exchange. She bought fresh strawberries from a vendor, early season but already sweet and fragrant, and ate them as she walked, the juice running slightly down her fingers, their taste the pure essence of spring. At another stall, she found herself admiring hand-knitted items, scarves and hats and mittens in beautiful colors, and spoke with the elderly woman who'd made them, who explained in careful English about the sheep the wool came from, the natural dyes she used, the patterns passed down through her family. The church tower bells began to ring, noon, marking the middle of the day, and Lyla stood still to listen. The bells were deep and resonant, their sound rolling across the square and beyond, a sound that had marked time in this city for centuries, that had called people to prayer and celebration and mourning, that had been heard by Vermeer and all the generations before and since. When the bells finished, she started walking again, no longer wandering but heading back toward the train station, her morning in Delft feeling complete. She crossed the final canal, leaving the old center, passing back into the newer city, the modern apartments and practical shops. At the station she checked the departure board, trains to Amsterdam every 15 minutes, the next one in 7 minutes. She bought a bottle of water from a kiosk and made her way to the platform, where a handful of other passengers waited. The train arrived precisely on time, as Dutch trains seemed to do, and she found a seat by the window. As the train pulled away, she watched Delft recede, the church towers visible above the rooflines, the green of the trees along the canals, the red tile roofs spreading in every direction. She thought about the morning, the market and the canals, the cheese and the stroopwafel and the apple tart, the hidden courtyard and the leaning towers, the cyclists and the ducks and the spring light that made everything luminous. She thought about Vermeer and his patient observation, his transformation of the ordinary into art. And she thought about how the best travel days were sometimes the simple ones. No famous monuments checked off a list, no dramatic adventures, just walking and observing, eating and resting, letting a place reveal itself at its own pace. Delft had done exactly that, offering itself quietly, without insistence, and she'd received it gratefully, carrying away the memory of this gentle spring morning in this beautiful understated Dutch city. The train picked up speed, the landscape outside becoming fields and farms and distant windmills, and Lyla settled back in her seat, content and slightly drowsy, the morning's walk catching up with her, ready for whatever the afternoon in Amsterdam might bring, but not quite ready to let go of Delft just yet, holding it a little longer in her mind like the taste of strawberries still lingering on her tongue.